time to bring it all home now with how to use best methods for obtaining approval for overhead and profit. Now, I want to direct you now to the opening statement. The opening statement, I feel like, has an incredible amount of power, firepower to it, and when laid out and articulated correctly, it should really create the premise for why overhead and profit should be approved. Before we get into that, though, I really want to take a look at, again, what the insurance companies, what their definition of overhead and profit is, like when it should be required. And first, a little bit of history behind that. When I first got involved in the industry 20 plus years ago, and even as recently as maybe 7-8 years ago, I want to say, is when they stopped it. It was any 3 trades or more would justify overhead and profit. That would trigger overhead and profit, and that's when the insurance companies would approve overhead and profit. So if it was roofing, gutters, fencing, for example, that's 3 trades, and you have your overhead and profit. Fencing, siding, drywall, or painting, 3 trades or more, overhead and profit. It was very easy. There was a black and white line that if you crossed that threshold, you were granted overhead and profit most of the time. But somewhere along the line, about, like I said, about 7 or 8 years ago, probably about 2010, 2011 approximately, we started to hear, well, it doesn't matter how many trades there are, that's not how we determine overhead and profit. And it's like, really, well, what is it that you use then? Of course there's 3 trades or more. And it was just like unheard of when they started this. And the answer that we would get back was, well, it has to reach a level of overall complexity and or coordination that's required of a general contractor. And it's like, how does that go again? Well, it has to reach a level of complexity, and they just say the same thing over again. And it's like, well, what does that mean exactly? Like, what we're really seeking is, where is the line? Where's the threshold that you cross when the job is then determined that it is, it has reached the level of complexity and or coordination that's required of a general contractor. And you try to nail the adjusters down on this, and most of them don't even have a way of really describing or answering the logic behind that. So you see what they've done? And it started with State Farm, and then other insurance companies could see that it was working, and so they just followed suit, which gave State Farm even more, power. And then it became, so the thing you have to understand is the 3 trade rule was never really a rule, right? Like a written rule. It was a rule that was followed. It was a standard in the industry, but it was never a rule that was written somewhere, or a law, if you will. People say, oh, that's the law. Any 3 trades or more, you have to pay that. But that's not accurate. I mean, there sure have been rulings and things in various states. But again, I'm not an attorney, so I couldn't get into the law behind overhead and profit. Now, other people, attorneys could get into that and really could go all day, and give you a whole nother look and more depth behind that. But if you followed along with this training course, we're not here to be the attorneys or the public adjusters. We're not here to use law or policy or coverage to win. We're just going to use documentation and facts and details to win. The actual scope of work, the job that's required, the actual documentation of damage, actual building codes. Those are the things that we're going to use. So we're going to leave that to those smart lawyers to handle that. But essentially, overhead and profit is not something that, so technically, a lawyer will probably tell you that every policy includes overhead and profit already, right? Whether they hire a contractor or not. And I'm not going to dive too deep into that for the reasons I just said, is that this is not the forum for that, right? So, but if you could just know that the logic starts there, that every policy has overhead and profit built into it. And so, but a lot of contractors I see that use that argument with the adjusters, they say, hey, overhead and profit's in the policy, it's already included. I know what's supposed to be included, you have to approve it. That's not going to take you very far at all, because you're using the rules of someone else's game to win your game. Because remember, your game is not policy and coverage. So you can't use what's already included in the policy as your logic to win. That's for the attorneys and the public adjusters do. But for you, you've got to get there a different way, right? So you have to understand where they're coming from and what they're even trying to say with this complexity and coordination thing. And you got to nail them down on it. So whenever I've come close to that, the closest I've come is adjusters will explain that basically, if it's not at the level of complexity, then we basically think that you can do it all at once with the same folks, same tradespeople, all at the same time. So like trades are not overlapping on top of each other. And that's the complexity, right? And you have to use, and you're using actual subcontractors and not like employees, right? So there's the coordination aspect of it, of a general contractor, right? And so if you can get an adjuster who actually even understands it themselves, they're going to give you explanation that's somewhat close to that logic that I've just laid out. But it's an unwritten rule, right? The 3-trade rule was an unwritten rule that they have successfully somehow moved it to a new rule, right? That's still not a written down rule, but it is the industry standard that almost all the insurance companies follow. Most of them do not use the 3-trade rule anymore. It's rare that you'll run into someone that still uses that they are out there. I ran into one not too long ago, but it's rare. So they're living by the new logic, the new standard, the new rule of it must reach the overall level of complexity and or coordination that's required of a general contractor, right? And so that's the new rule that's been moved from of old, from an unwritten rule that's moved to a new unwritten rule. Now I will tell you though, that kind of rule of thumb, if there's interior work on the job, so like there could be 7 trades of exterior work and they still won't want to give you overhead and profit. A lot of the adjusters won't want to give you overhead and profit. That's not complex enough, right? So forget about the 3-trade rule. It could be 7 trades of exterior work and they still don't want to give it to you. But interior work, that should automatically trigger overhead and profit. Now, a lot of them won't give it to you on the estimate, but they'll give it to you easier when asked, because it's something that should trigger automatically overhead and profit on the interior, depending on what it is. But typically, even just a water spot, now if they say water spot, that just has to be patched, well, that's an incorrect scope, right? So that to them may not reach the level of complexity and or coordination required of a general contractor. But if done correctly, like we talked about before, we're not just going to patch a spot. That drywall must be removed and the wet insulation behind it must be removed, antimicrobial agent applied, drywall replaced, insulation replaced, drywall replaced, texture replaced, everything's got to be painted. The entire ceiling. We've got to mask and tape, mask and cover the floor, contents move out, then reset. See, now we're getting more complex than just coming in and patching a spot. So that's another reason why you need to be so detailed on the inspection, because you're looking to get the job to reach that level of complexity. The more complex it is, the more items you've found, the more trades that you've found, and you've gone inside, you've inspected every room, closet, and hallway on the inside, then chances are you found a lot more damage that people didn't even know about in the first place, and you have moved the job to the level of complexity and or coordination that's required of a general contractor. Interior work, the logic behind that is when you're doing all that work, you got to come in and out of that house or building multiple times just to do a little bit of drywall. You have to work around the client's schedule, different trades overlap on each other. So usually with the interior, if spelled out and articulated correctly to the insurance company, that should in and of itself almost always trigger overhead and profit. Now there's a new thing in the last couple of years where Safeco and Liberty Mutual and other insurance companies are getting notorious for this, where they'll give you the overhead and profit, but not on the roofing related items, which I think is the most ridiculous thing in the world. And you just have to try to play hardball with them as much as possible. In other words, like, we understand that's your policy, but this is our price, and settle for as high as you can get kind of deal. Like you might have to put in more rounds to try to get better results with those insurance companies, but ultimately you may have to take those hits. But if you get the rest of the job up and get all the other items in there, again, if you have to take that hit, hopefully you were able to get the profit up so much higher than you would have before you started. So like, well, I'm going to take it to appraisal because I can't get them to give me the overhead and profit on the roof. Yeah, but you just got it up 30 grand, so leave it alone. That's kind of my take, so I'm going to get the numbers up there. I may not get overhead and profit, but I get them to give me something else. Maybe that's when I introduce those supervision hours back into it, or roofing labor hours. But that's kind of my take on that. So, we've got everything that's led us up to here should have built the groundwork to help you display and articulate why the job is so complex. Because everything we've been doing has been about details. And so that's the history of overhead and profit. They've moved the line to where it is now, and I feel like we need to understand that before jumping into this part. But here's where we're going to jump in to the opening statement and really break that down and discuss why it's important to have a proper opening statement in the estimate. And we talked about this when we were building the estimate before, but now we're going to dive into it in a little bit more depth, and we're going to follow that up with how to use more documentation to ensure that you're getting overhead and profit approved more times than not.